I want to welcome all of you to the Wednesday study. And I'm delighted to announce that we will be actually resuming our study next week at the Peachtree Church at the Lodge. And it's going to be great to see those of you who are going to be able to join us in the physical, back into the analog world rather than just the digital world. But for those of you who are with us on Zoom and who won't be able to join us, we're going to continue, of course, our Zoom presence. So that's going to extend it then for those of you who are from other parts of the country and around the world. And I want us to then pick up where we left off. And when we go to the website, I want you to notice a couple of things. By the way, there's a new one, the last in this series we call, this is the Handbook to God's Promises. And it looks like this. It's this leather edition of, you'd never guess it's 707 pages, but it's basically a 52-week study of the promises of God. And I encourage you to give it a go, but it's a very helpful, simple way of going through that material. And it's also available in another format as well. Take a look at it's also in paperback versions as well. And all the handbooks really are kind of a collection of these things. And I'm very pleased that now all 9 of them are available in leather, bonded leather, and also now we're putting them into paperback editions as well. And the whole point of this is really to empower and encourage and equip people so that they can become people of prayer and of the Word, and so that they can have tools for equipping them for renewal. It's one of the huge things that I keep on hammering, because I'm so keen on getting people to really become people of the Word and people who grasp the importance of the world. And the Word, and the proportion of time that we spend in the world versus the Word. The increasing the ratio of the Word to the world is very critical for us. So when we look at these resources, it's really easy for us to try using these things and to giving them a go in terms of our use. Now, going back to where we are, though, on the weekly studies, we continue. We go to the Wednesday morning study, and here we go to the 1 Corinthians series. We alternate Old and New Testament, as you know. So we were up to chapter 7 in 1 Corinthians 2 weeks ago. So we're going to be picking up with 1 Corinthians chapter 8 in our session now. And in looking at that, we're seeing questions that Paul is addressing, a number of questions that relate to authoritative answers to thorny questions that Paul that were being raised. And so I want to go to a keynote presentation that I have used before and kind of take you through that, because to give you an overview of where we were before, we saw that there were the book breaks up into first of all an answer to a report about division in that church that Paul had received from Chloe. And he deals with the matter of division and the reasons for their divisions. And because they were now having factions, and it was the problem of disunity, and rather than centrality around Christ, it was personality figures. And it was always this idea then, and this a problem that we have even today now, when you begin to focus more on a character or a communicator rather than the centrality of Christ, then what we have is there's an arrogance, there's a personality cult, and all those things can then take us away from fidelity to the one who really should bind us and unite us together, and it's the Lord Christ. And so he talks about that. And then there are a number of questions then about real issues in the church, because the old phrase is that you can get the church, you can put the church in Corinth, but you can't get Corinth out of the church, was the expression, because Corinth was known for its corruption because of the context in which they were immersed. And there was even incestual relations that were being tolerated. There were matters of litigation between believers. There was sexual immorality. So he deals with this as well. And now, beginning in chapter 7, he answers questions of really fundamental authoritative answers to thorny questions that were raised by the Corinthians. And so we saw, first of all, a couple of weeks ago, the first question concerning the issue of marriage and of celibacy and of divorce and of remarriage. That's what we looked at a couple of weeks ago. And then today, the chapters are going to be dealing with the problem of meat offered up to idols. And in chapters 8 through 10, we're going to be looking at that theme. And then he's going to also be illustrating from his own life these twin principles of Christian liberty. And also, what's the law of love? What does that look like? And he's going to conclude that believers must sometimes limit their liberty for the sake of weaker brothers. So the stronger brother may need to limit his liberty so that he can be concerned about helping those who are weak in faith, as he puts it. And you see a parallels we'll see with Romans 4:14. And then he's going to turn to matters concerning public worship. So again, more questions. So he's just answering a series of these important questions that were being raised. And one of those concerns improper observance of the Lord's Supper. And there was a selfish use as well of spiritual gifts that was plaguing the church. So this church really was bristling with difficulties and problems. These spiritual gifts were to be exercised in love for the edification of the entire body. And then they were also having, if that wasn't enough, they were also having problems with the resurrection, which Paul had to correct, because you see his historical and theological defense of the resurrection required teaching on the nature of the resurrection body, because you see the Corinthians probably had been struggling over that issue because the idea of a resurrected body was disdainful in Greek thought. And they had this dualistic notion that the physicality, that the body was not a good thing. And then this epistle closes with Paul's instructions for the collection that he's going to be making for the saints in Jerusalem that he tells them about. And that's in chapter 16. And then he follows it with miscellaneous exhortations and greetings. And I'd also then kind of summarize the two sets of three topics, which mirror the three-part focus of the book. The first being divisions in the church, the second being, you'd say, disorder in the church, and the third, difficulties in the church. Or another way of seeing it is from concern to condemnation to counsel, as he addresses the problems and issues in the Corinthian church. So this was written, as we said before, in Ephesus during his third missionary journey in the year 56. So it just gives you a sense of that. And while we're at it, I should mention just a quick overview of its theme and purpose. The basic theme of this epistle, as we look at this image here, is the application of Christian principles on an individual and on a social level. So here this is from Corinth, the Ark of Corinth, where the people would come, many sailors and others would come, and there was a temple prostitutes where they would presumably, quote, worship. And so it was a corrupt context in which we then had to have the gospel applied. And these Christian principles were done on an individual and on a social level. And the purpose of this epistle was really transformation. So we know that the cross of Christ is a message that's designed to transform lives of believers, to make them different, to make people different as a corporate body and make them different from the surrounding world. But the Corinthians were destroying their Christian testimony because of immorality and disunity. So we see then that Paul wrote this letter, as we've already seen, as a corrective response to this news of problems and disorders among the Corinthians, and it was designed to refute improper attitudes and conduct. And it was also designed to promote a spirit of unity among the brethren in their relationships and worship. So this whole theme of unity out of that diversity is critical. This, by the way, is a Corinthian column. Paul's concern as their spiritual father was tempered with love, and he wanted to avoid visiting with them, as he said in chapter 4:21, with a rod. And then some of the keys, while we're at it, would be the key word, which we selected correction, because it's a difficult work, a corrective work, to help the Corinthians walk in a manner worthy of their calling, and so correction. And one of the two key verses in this is this text: "Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own?" He then says, "You were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify your body and in your spirit, which are God's," you see. So you have to worship him in that way. And another key verse is going to be this text, a corrective regarding pride and temptation. "Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overcome you or overtaken you, except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it." So this is a very important text, and we'll take a look at that as well. And I'd say the key chapter provides the best definition the world's ever seen of love, chapter 13. It's read at weddings, often the text for sermons. And it's won the hearts of people around the world because it is indeed the greatest. But of course, it's more than an emotion. It's something that, in fact, is primarily action, and it's an impossible thing to be attained apart from the grace and power of God. The quality then of love is manifested, in fact, and seen insofar as it's God who loved the world that he gave. So it's a love that gives. And then its contribution to the Bible. And this is an image, by the way, of the bema, which is the judgment seat, and where Paul was accused by the Corinthian Jews of sacrilege. But it's an image that Paul uses as well of the judgment seat that was also used for the celebration at the Isthmian Games of the athletes who would be rewarded for their achievements. So it's a metaphor, a use of the bema of Christ, that believers will all stand before that judgment seat, not a judgment of condemnation, but one of reward. But it's a very critical image that we see. And so it's really practical in its thrust. It focuses on basic social and moral and spiritual issues. And unlike Romans, 1 Corinthians isn't really rhetorically elegant. It's a very plain, very earnest, and very unvarnished epistle indeed. The unusual simplicity and directness of this letter is really quite appropriate due to the practical content. So the sentences are not complicated. It's very different from Romans because it has a different purpose. And Paul forcefully amplifies his thoughts with a lot of different literary devices, narrative and sarcasm and appeal and so forth. So there are a lot of important contributions. Here's yet another image. Here's a modern view of the ruins of ancient Corinth. And though it's informal, 1 Corinthians does make several important contributions to the doctrines of the New Testament. It's particularly true of the doctrines of the church as an organism, the role of spiritual gifts, and the central chapter in all of Scripture on the resurrection itself and the nature of the resurrection body. And furthermore, no other epistle gives a better look at the problems and conditions in an apostolic church. And so even though it was planted and it was nurtured by the Apostle Paul himself, yet this church at Corinth simply bristled with social and ethical and spiritual and doctrinal problems. So this had to be a really difficult letter for Paul to write, but his very profound wisdom and insight dominate the pages. and reveal his patient love and also his self-control. So there's a wide variety of subjects discussed in this long epistle. In fact, only Romans is longer. And it's easy to follow because of its logical and orderly development. And then while I'm at it, I would say a quick word about how Christ is seen in this epistle. And he's relevant to every area of life. And that's one of the things I love about this, is the idea he became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. These are themes that Paul will address in this epistle. And so there are lots of themes that we see, and we'll talk about some applications later on, but these are themes that I wanted us to unpack and underscore. So with that in mind, then, I thought it'd be good then for us to just zoom in now on chapter 8. And I'm going to also jump to chapter 10 because chapter 9 is kind of a transitional or an intermediate point that and then he picks up again back with the idea of idolatry. So the second question Paul discusses, so he's going to be talking about questions relating to meat offered to idols. And so what about this business of food offered to idols and the importance of doing all things to the glory of God? And we'll see something about that and why that's the case. The apostle states that those who know that there is but one God, so they understand that, they know that, and that the idols are meaningless, then they're at liberty to partake of that food that had been offered in pagan temples. Part of the reason why that was an issue an option for them is because the food that was these offerings that were made at these pagan temples, well, you can be pretty confident that the so-called gods never ate them. They have mouths but they couldn't eat, they couldn't drink, they couldn't feed, of course. They couldn't see, they couldn't speak. So they just would offer them, as happens around the world even now when you go to these temples. When I went to India, when I went to Bangkok, when I went to Hong Kong, and you go to these temples, and they offer the fruit, they offer various gifts to the gods, and of course, the gods don't do anything. They take them away. So they would sell them more cheaply. So the idea then, you know that these are not real gods, and therefore you figure, okay, we can just buy them more cheaply than buying them in the market. But some had a problem with that because of the concern that they had with whether they really would be a problem. Aren't they gods and so forth? So there was a question. There was a debate about that. So the question is, don't allow your liberty. So those of you who have faith and you say they're not gods at all, they're to become a stumbling block to those who don't have this knowledge. You see, knowledge by itself can make one arrogant. So knowledge can puff up, but you have to have love that will humble you and make you willing then to consider the needs of others. So knowledge must be tempered by the love of Christ. And the love of Christ seeks to nurture other people. So in those cases, it's better not to exercise one's freedom in cases where that would cause another's conscience to be wounded. And so the prayer that we offer, and this is from Daily Growth, and we do this every year. We go through the 365 key chapters of the Bible. And this particular prayer, I acknowledge that there is but one God the Father, from whom are all things, and I exist for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and I exist through him. And so this is this 1 Corinthians 8:6 text. So let's just zoom in onto the text itself with more detail and work our way through that, and then have some discussion of it. And then I also want to look at, as I said, jump ahead to chapter 10, because he picks up on this theme of idolatry. So as we look at this text then, he says, now concerning, and so this phrase that he uses, now concerning, that's a way of seeing his outline, because now it's another question. So as he's answering questions then, that's the order of this epistle. this portion of it. Things sacrificed to idols. So there was a debate over this matter, and the wider issue of Christian liberty is the question of whether we are dealing with these problems. But whether it's not a matter of that now, but we do have other issues that we have to get involved with. And I still remember, even when I was teaching at the King's College, it reminds me of certain issues that they had. They had certain requirements. And as I recall, when I was there, and I was teaching there from, 76 to 79, as I recall, the students, about 900 of them, it was a Christian liberal arts college. I don't believe they were allowed to go to movie theaters at that time. I guess they could watch movies on TV or something. It's kind of, these things were always inconsistent. I can't remember the rules about all these details, but you hear about these rules and regulations. There were some places where you couldn't even use dice; it wasn't there, but you could use spinners. It was strange kind of rules and regulations that were associated with these matters. So you have to be careful, because it would sometimes be a legalistic mindset that you'd have the filthy five and the nasty nine and the dirty dozen. I don't smoke, drink, or chew, nor associate with those who do. That kind of mindset. And so you're focused on what you're against, is this mindset, kind of a legalistic orientation of what you're against rather than what you are for. So there's always a danger for that. So he's speaking about this concept here and emphasizing that the strong believers then, we understand what's really going on. They have a sense of knowledge, but the knowledge must be tempered by love. So he goes on to say, now concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know that we have all knowledge. He's saying we understand what's really going on. Knowledge, though, he says, by itself makes arrogant. He says, but love edifies. And that's a very important theme. If you just have knowledge without love, it can lead to a cold legalism or cold orthodoxy. And we've seen conditions where there are those who have a doctrinal clarity and orthodoxy, and yet they're almost loveless. There's a heartlessness that you can see. And then there are some who are full of love, but they're wishy-washy when it comes to their theology. And that's why I love Ephesians chapter 4:15. Speaking the truth in love is the wonderful balanced combination. Truth and love are not at loggerheads. They're not inimical. They go together, and that's the combination. So he says here as well, knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies, because love seeks the best good of the one that it is, in fact, thinking about. So love is always, as I call it, the steady intention of your will toward another person's highest good. So he says, if anyone supposes that he knows anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by him. So really, we're defined ultimately by our love for God and by the way we know him and are known by him. So he says, therefore, now he gets to his specifics. This is a basic principle. Now he gets to the application. Concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, here's where the knowledge comes in. Those who understand that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, in the idea that they're not real. They are images, but there's no vitality, there's no life. They're not alive. That there is no God but one. So even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father. And I love this statement, from whom are all things, and we exist for him, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. When I think about these approximately 330 million gods and goddesses in Hinduism, it's an incredible thing. They have the elephant god and monkey gods and all kinds of deities, and it's just an arbitrary array of these things. And but at the end of the day, none of these things really have a focus. That it's just What is the unity in this all? There's only one God. And so people constantly come up with these intermediaries. It's a religious attempts to reach God is what it comes down to. And the reason why they have these gods and goddesses is because the one true God is too distant, too remote. The God that they can see who created all things, Romans 1, is one that is so far removed that they want to create these intermediaries that they can placate, make offerings to, bargain with. And so this is what it comes down to, kind of working it out. And that's what religion's about, our attempts to reach and manipulate the God or the gods as they perceive it. This is why I say one of the things that's really unique about biblical Christianity is that it's not a religion. And I stress this. It's not a religion. Religions are man's attempts to reach to God, to placate or attempt to be right before God. That is not what Christianity is all at all. It's not about that. Christianity is something richer than that. And I've come to see it this way. In fact, I'm thinking about a book title here. Knowing Jesus isn't a religion. It's a romance. And that's what it really is. It's a romance. Why is it a romance? Because he's the sacred romancer of your soul. He's the one who pursued you. He's the one who woos you, calls you to himself. And so he's the one who romances you, draws you to himself, and we're part of the bride of Christ. So it's a beautiful portrait. And we're part of a story in which, although we're in a fallen world, we see that the fourth act is yet to come, where it's the consummation of all things, and it ends well. And that's why Dante calls it a comedy because it ends well. So if you put the two together, you know what we're living in? We're living in a romantic comedy. It's a romance by the living God, and it's going to end well. So this is a very different picture, isn't it? Very different way of looking at the world than we would see in the machinations of men, the religious dimensions that we've kind of conjured up for ourselves. I'd like you to chew on the kind of an application. I'd like you to take this verse 6 and make that your verse that you'd maybe put on a 3x5 card, write it out in your own handwriting, and chew on it today. There's but one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for him. And one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. That's a rich text for meditation. But then he says, going from knowledge, however, not all men have this knowledge, but some being accustomed to the idol until now, eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol. In other words, they don't have this understanding. They're not as mature, and their conscience being weak is defiled. He says, food will not commend us to God. We're neither the worse if we do not eat, nor the better if we do eat. But take care, and this is his advocation. He says, I want to make sure that this liberty of yours doesn't become a stumbling block to the weak. So he's saying the stronger person, the stronger brethren, ought not to allow the weaker or let their liberty cause the weaker brother to stumble. Because he says if somebody sees you, and you have knowledge, and they see that you dining in an idol's temple, in other words, you're eating food that was offered there, will not his conscience, if he's weak, be strengthened to eat things because he sees you're doing, I guess I can do it. But he doesn't have the faith to do it. And Paul tells us this in Romans 14, whatever is not of faith is sin. So for him, it's faith, but for the other, it's not. He says, through your knowledge, he is weak, is ruined, and the brother for whose sake Christ died. And so, by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. That's why he makes his application. Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. So what he means by this then, I won't eat that kind of meat. If it's going to be, I would not go and eat meat that was bought or taken from a temple. There would be meat in the marketplace, it'd be a higher price, but that would be what he would do. Now, chapter 9 speaks about this general theme of liberty, and a couple of weeks from now we'll discuss that more specifically, his whole idea of liberty. And I'm going to be talking about this in terms of common ground without compromise. It's a brilliant defense of how he seeks to use his life and opportunities in the most effective manner. But then we pick up in chapter 10 about this matter again of idolatry. And he speaks about this and uses their history as those whose fathers were all under the cloud. And he speaks here and passed through the sea. So you're talking about then the Shekinah glory of God that was a pillar of fire by night and cloud by day. They passed through the sea. They were baptized, went through the water into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food, the manna. They drank the same spiritual drink, the water that was provided by God. They were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them. Remember when he struck the rock and it flowed water. And the rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. So he speaks of this, and these are images that they were actually types of the one who would come. Nevertheless, he says, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. And now this is a very important verse for us. He says, now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. In other words, when you read the Old Testament and you are now under the new covenant, you're no longer under the Mosaic law. You and I are privileged to see these tales, these stories, these principles, and they still serve as living exemplars so that we can see actual examples of the consequences of obedience and of disobedience, that we would not crave evil things as they craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written. How the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. And then it describes how, in that context, they made the molten calf. So, nor let us act immorally as some of them did. 23,000 fell in a day. And let us try the Lord as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. So he describes specific events that we know occurred during the wilderness experience. Nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, all these things happened, as he said earlier, as an example. So he mentioned as examples in verse 6. Now he goes further and mentions it more specifically. This is a very important way of looking at verse 11. Now, these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. You must grasp how critically privileged you are, that you and I are privileged to have in your hands the Bible that contains the work and the oracles of God going down from the old covenant and now revealing the new covenant, and how the old is in the new revealed, you see, and the new is in the old concealed, and how we now have the progress of Revelation. We can look back and see the history of the works of God in his works, his message in the world, and in his works and in his ways and in his will. And you see all of that leading up ultimately, and that the inspired word of God actually all points to the incarnate word who would come, Christ Jesus, and that the incarnate word of God would then become the indwelling word who now is in us. So we are privileged to have a perspective that we have been given, but to whom much has been given, much will be required. And so we have this knowledge, and God holds us accountable. But it's a rich portrait to see. They happen to them as examples, and for us. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. So do not become arrogant. Don't become a person who then supposes that you have all knowledge or that you will not succumb. As soon as you think that you are impervious, you are vulnerable. No temptation has overcome you or overtaken you, but such as is common to man. In other words, you're not experiencing something that others have not experienced before. He says God's faithful. He's not going to allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. That's why Jesus says, do not lead us into temptation, deliver us from evil. So he says, don't put us in a situation beyond the capacity that you would grant for us to be delivered. So with the temptation, he says, he'll provide the way of escape also so that you may be able to endure it. So there are times when it seems beyond our endurance, but ultimately he's stretching our faith, because your faith will grow when it goes beyond what you thought you could do. And then we find that he gives us the grace, when he gives us more than we thought we could manage, but in his grace, that severe mercy will often be used to draw us and drive us closer to him in a way that otherwise would not have occurred without that difficulty, without that severe mercy, without that loving wound. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. You judge what I say. Is not the cup of blessing which we bless as sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread which we break as sharing in the body of Christ? Since there is one bread, we are many, or one body. We all partake of the one bread. Look at the nation of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices sharers in the altars? So he says, it's not that the thing sacrificed is anything, or the idol's anything, but the thing he's saying is that they sacrifice to demons. I don't want you to be sharing in that. So what he is saying is that all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. So you have to use your wisdom, your discernment. Let no one seek his own good, but consider the good of your neighbor. So he says, eat anything that's sold in the meat market without asking questions, for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. But he says, if one of the unbelievers invites you to, and you want to go, eat anything that's set before you. Don't ask questions. But if anyone says to you, oh, this is meat, then don't eat it, because you see, then there's a compunction for the sake of the one who informed you, because you can see it's an issue. So it's not for your conscience, but his. Because he's saying then you're going to be considering their needs. So whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, he says, everything you do can be done to the glory of God. And I love that text. So no matter what you do, it can be done to the glory of God. And so he says, give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. So his desire is not to seek his profit, but to the profit of many, that they may be saved. And so we've talked about this whole matter of idolatry, and I've actually added 2 more P's to my list of idols. So I've got 9 of them now. So the heart is, as we've seen before, as Calvin put it, an idol factory. And there are so many idols that we can create, and they may not be made of wood or gold or stone or whatever, but they're still idols nevertheless. And they are idols for destruction if they become anything that consumes us more in our heart than God. So as I sometimes put it as well, we all have a fear object. And the fear object is, what do we fear losing more than anything else? I find it interesting that people don't like hearing about the fear of God. They don't want to hear about that, even though the scriptures are rife with it from the beginning, Genesis to Revelation. It talks about who will not fear him and glorify his name. The loving kindness of the Lord is upon those who fear him. It's so that fear and love are not inimical. But yet we don't want to hear about the fear of God. But yeah, even though we're told it's the foundation for wisdom. So I asked this question, okay, you don't want to hear about the fear of God. Tell me then, what is it that you do fear? If it's not God, what do you fear then? Or who do you fear? Because you will fear something. And what you fear will define you. Because it'll also define what you love most. So if it's not, so just like Joshua said, as for me and my house, we will fear the Lord. So also you have to say, choose you this day whom you will serve. I would say, choose you this day whom you will fear as well. And if it's not God, it will be something. And that's why it's important for us to ask this question. You don't have an option. You will fear something. And if your fear is the loss of possessions or pleasure or prestige or promotion or power or performance or people's approval or position or popularity, if that is, it takes precedent over your fear of the divine displeasure and disappointment, And and at the same time, our what we should love is the divine pleasure, the divine delight. So what we should fear the divine disappointment and love the divine delight. Well done, good and faithful servant. You see, because it's what we really want, what we long for really is love, joy, and peace, as I've said before. And you'll not find them in these idols because they're idols for destruction. God will brook no rival. He will accept no alternative to himself as being the first and foremost in your heart, in your attention, and in your desire. Because you and I are called then to journey from idolatry toward faith. We're called then to move away from those things which would tether us to this world and to ask instead, what is it that you truly do love? What do you love more than anything else? And so that whole notion then is this question, what do you want? We're living in this world under increasing pressure to conform to its folly, its foolishness. And things, as we see, are moving more and more away from fidelity to God's purposes. And indeed, as in my view of eschatology, I see that the stage is being set for the next act. But instead of wringing my hands in despair, I now sense a greater sense of urgency, if anything, to use the present opportunity, the windows that we have, so that we can use the very brief time, the window of opportunity for the agency of God's purposes in our lives. You're here for purpose. You've been called for such a time as this. And it's necessary for us then to be God's people for this time and for this place. You are called for such a time as this, and you do not want to miss this by succumbing to trivial pursuits. At the end of the day, everything matters. And so you have to ask, what do you love? Who do you love? And how do you express that love more than anything else? So we're under pressure and we're living under seduction. I'm going to be doing this. We're going to be having this Reflections Ministries men's conference in September 24 to 26. And we're going to be talking about pilgrims on a narrow way. And that whole theme, that idea of a narrow way, pilgrims, we're all on this journey, but we're heading somewhere. Significantly, though, you don't have a choice as to whether you're on a journey. The question is whether you're on a journey toward the ultimate Father, the cross, which is the way of actual life itself. Or are you on a journey toward the seductions of the world, which will actually leave you cold and dead? So the calling, your destination, we have to decide what that pilgrimage looks like and what do we love more than anything else. So we look at the outward world, the outward pressures, and then we have to sustain ourselves by having an inward fidelity, an inward life, and an upward vision of what life is meant to be about, and so that we have a sense of our calling and purpose in this world. We'll open it up for some interaction.
Hello, Dr. Kemp?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the book from South Africa. Your teaching continues to bless me every now and then when I listen to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're most welcome, Toe. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. I'm asking in relation to the food that are served to the idols.
Yes.
In our case in South Africa, when one gets saved, not all the family members follow the person and become saved. They become, most of the family members become trapped in their rituals and continue to practice them.
Yes.
One of the rituals is ancestral worshiping or serving the ancestors.
That's right.
Where the family members in that ceremony will go to the graves, ask for blessings, and then come back and then have a feast.
Yes.
Now, my question here is, when you are coming from that kind of a family and you are saved, What do you do when you are invited to come to those ceremonies?
Yeah.
Do you refuse and alienate the family, or do you accept the invitation and compromise your faith? And most often, when you refuse, you are regarded as arrogant, and you are perceived as someone who's self-important, who do not want to be part of the family practice.
Yes, that's a very good question, To. And I not having been raised in that cultural context, one possible alternative that strikes me, but you would know more about an approach that could be taken. One approach that comes to my mind would be to contextualize. I'm here to honor this person. It's not that I embrace the idea that it's ancestral worship, but rather I'm here to express my honor of this person's memory, and express publicly my love for this person. But I want it to be known that it is not my embrace that I'm seeking to now have some kind of ancestral worship, or the idea that this person now is to be a spirit that I'm now speaking to or trying to placate or speak to. So, but it's hard for us to convey that because you're basically rejecting the whole system. But it's very interesting in the culture today because it's perfunctory even now. There are many contexts in which that takes place where people go to those ceremonies but hardly believe it themselves. I just saw, for example, a film called Tokyo Story. Again, it's a beautiful, wonderful film. And this was done in 1953 by a Japanese director. But it was intriguing because in such a ceremony, when this woman dies, you could see that you had a Buddhist ceremony. And it was very much along that notion, that idea. But basically, the people were there, but it was perfunctory. It wasn't that they really embraced that. It was more of just that they were attending a thing, but rather than actually and essentially believing in it. So it's a really complex thing. What does your presence symbolize? I suppose it would mean, is the question that would raise. And I'm sure that's something that's been discussed in that culture and how it would be perceived. Is there a way of conveying that so that you could go in that context with integrity?
Good evening, Dr. Ken. This is To.
Yes.
Just now, the gentleman asked about do we participate in all these rituals when we are safe? I think I can relate to his situation, whereby in Malaysia, over this side, when I became a Christian and I told my parents, they accepted me because we all came from the Buddhist and the Taoist culture. But when it comes to going to the cemetery to pay respect to our loved ones that has passed on, but we do not participate in holding the justice and whatever they do, we do not participate with that. But we buy these flowers and we go to the cemetery and we just place onto the cemetery there and we bow our head.
I see.
You know?
Yes.
It is the thing that we make known to our family members that we do respect the date also. But we do not worship or pray.
Yes.
But we just put our flowers and respect them.
That's a helpful thing, To, and it might be seen in this way. If you take a look at chapter 9 that we're going to be looking at in a couple of weeks, when Paul says, "Though I'm free from all men, I have made myself." I don't know if we have time. A slave to all, just anticipating. To the Jews I became as a Jew, that I may win the Jews. To those who are under the law, but not that I'm actually under that. But he says. But he says, to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all men, so I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel. So I call that common ground without compromise. So to the degree to which I can have common ground, and you just described that as going there, having and showing signs of respect, flowers and so forth, but not at the same time going to where you compromise yourself by some kind of a formal ceremony that would actually participate in something that would be claiming something that would be sub-biblical about that. That would be, so that's, I think, what Paul would do. He tries to have common ground as much as he can. So that's why he says, he says to the Jews, so he says, so that I might win those. I do all things then, I have become all things to all men. I may by all means save some. So I think that's a creative alternatives that can be done. So that's where a prayerful discernment can take place. So one could go and do those things that are appropriate, but avoid those things or not. Those are good
yes, I do
questions.
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Dr. Ken, about you mentioned that Paul's letter that he will win the non-believers like in a family.
Mm-hmm.
Same likewise when my parents know that we are Christians, and she will set a food which when she cooks, and then she will set one portion aside for us to eat. The rest should offer to idols.
Yeah.
Because we told her out of love that we are not to participate in this food offered to idols. So then when she cooked, the food supposed to be offered to idol, she took out a portion of it before it's offered to idols. So I think what Paul mentioned is true, that even we shared the gospel with my late mother,
Mm-hmm.
It's not about the knowledge, how she knows, but she came to know the Lord because of the Christians, my church members. The Christian went there to pray for her, and she found that the love is so strong. The love is so strong. When she was an idol worshiper, the idol worshiper is only just one money. You go to temple, they say you donate this, you donate that.
Mm-hmm.
You contribute this, you contribute that. But when the Christians, church members went to pray, she really was touched by the Lord. And for years, she has been a idol worshiper. And finally, she said, I want to know who this God is. I don't want to worship all these idols anymore because I see the love of your people.
That's good.
So I can substantiate the testimony of what Paul says. The love is there.
Yes.
That draws a person to Christ.
That's good. And out of love, then, Paul seeks common ground without compromise. And you can do that. So love, he says, as far as I can go, I'm going to go reach into their world so I can bring them into mine. But without compromising my integrity to do so.
Ken, this is Dave Bars. Good morning.
Good morning, Dave.
So, Toe, I have a similar story. A friend of mine has been in Bible translation in Ghana for all of his life. When he was a child, his father was actually a witch doctor. And so everybody from all around would bring animals to be sacrificed to foretell the future, whether they should have a child or take a journey or whatever. And he and his brother went to a Catholic school. His father liked that idea because they were getting an education. And at some point, they became committed believers, and with fear and trepidation went to their father and told him that they wouldn't be able to eat any of the meat that he sacrificed anymore. And much to their surprise, he did the same thing, Toe. He set food aside for them that wasn't sacrificed, and allowed them to continue with their practice and their education. I've always been very touched at how God honored their decision to do that.
Again, really a creative alternative is that's what Daniel provided. Remember, he had a creative alternative. Rather than I won't do this, he said, let me just try it out. I'm not going to eat the king's food. Just test it out and see if we don't look better and are healthier. So it's an interesting approach. A creative alternative is And that's what Paul tries to do. Common ground without compromise. And it's all born out of love. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies.